Hi, everybody. Today I'm speaking with Jeremy Greenberg, Privacy Counsel at Future Privacy Forum, where he works to promote responsible data use and emerging technology. Jeremy, welcome and thanks for joining today.
Thank you, Rick. I'm happy to be here.
And we're happy to have you. Jeremy, you wrote an extensive report recently on extended reality and artificial intelligence. In the report, you write about virtual reality and related emerging technologies. Can you give us a brief background on what you've uncovered in that report and how it relates to consumer privacy?
Yes, definitely. I would be remiss if I did not mention my co-author, Joseph Jerome, who's with Common Sense Media. So for this report, we really follow what we view as a successful formula at FPF when we're looking at emerging technology. So we go into some background just explaining, what is the technology? We've heard these terms VR, AR, XR thrown around a lot. So we go into, what is the technology? What are the key use cases and benefits we're seeing today? And then we look at some of the specific ethical and privacy risks and challenges around this technology. And then we try to provide some best practices, some recommendations for companies, developers, those trying to regulate this technology, policymakers, and others. So we're creating what we hope is a very helpful educational resource. And I hope folks get a chance to take a look at it.
Yeah, it was a really well-written report, and I highly encourage anybody who is wanting to be knowledgeable on this space to read that. Let's drill down on a bunch of those things. So most of us have heard of virtual reality. I think when most of us think about virtual reality, we think about gaming. The virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, extended reality are terms, and then of course, VR, AR, MR, XR are terms that everybody throws around. And I'm not sure the layperson, if you will, or even some educated people really understand the differences there. Can you talk a little bit about the continuum of those acronyms and how they fit into that entire space?
Definitely, yeah, and yes, all of the different R's. And I think something really important to note here is we don't really have yet a standardized set of definitions for these technologies. Folks in these spaces sort of agree that these technologies have certain traits or characteristics, but we don't have these formalized definitions yet. So there can definitely be some overlap and some debate about the differences, but I would say that most folks in this space, when they think about XR or extended reality, that really acts as an umbrella term for AR, VR, MR. That's sort of the shorthand term that you're going to be talking about some sort of immersive reality. Yeah. Then we have virtual reality or VR, and VR is really all about immersion. So creating a digital space, a virtual world in which an individual is interacting with that world, with others. And it's generally enjoyed through specialty hardware. So something like a VR headset or head-mounted display, or HMD as it's called. So something like your Oculus Quest, your HTC Vive, the Valve Index, some of these well-known headsets. And really the goal here is to give that user a sense of presence, that they're really in this world interacting with it. AR, augmented reality, is a bit different. It's a little less about this immersion element. It's really more about taking the physical world and mapping digital elements into that world. So this is typically enjoyed through really any smart device fitted with a camera, very commonly mobile phones today. And a good example of AR that's really popular is Pokemon Go. So you're walking around outside, you're walking down the street, you're looking at your screen, your smartphone, and you see an image of the street where you're walking, and suddenly a digital Pokemon pops up integrated into that environment. So that's a good example of AR. MR, or mixed reality, shares more in common with AR than VR. So like AR, MR maps these digital elements onto the physical environment, but there's this extra layer of interactivity. So changes in the physical environment might impact the digital content and vice versa. And though we often talk about these technologies separately today, as we continue to see this technology emerge, we're likely going to see less of this separation and maybe a device or a set of devices that's able to integrate all of these technologies together.
Yeah, it's fascinating how it's just all coming together and developing both as technology and just a sort of a ubiquitous way of life for the way a lot of people, particularly the younger people of our generation, are starting to assimilate to. I mentioned earlier, when we think about virtual reality, and I use that as the generic term, I think most people associate that with gaming. I think there are far-reaching use cases way beyond gaming that have some interesting applications and use cases. And then we'll drill down a little bit, another question or two about the privacy implications of that. But can you talk about some of the other use cases beyond gaming where these worlds are starting to emerge?
Yes, definitely. So obviously gaming that's still the main use case we're seeing. There's so much investment into gaming now. We have a number of developers working on VR games and those types of experiences. But some other really emerging areas in the VR world include employment. So we're seeing VR used as a training tool. So studies in this area are still pretty limited, but it seems like training an employee using VR rather than traditional training with a PowerPoint or an employee manual or something like that is much more effective. Those employees retain much more information. And we're seeing this used often in the retail space. So we have big retailers like Walmart, Verizon, using this technology for training for their Verizon store employees. We're seeing Sprouts grocery store using this as a training tool. And this will often help these employees train on a maybe new piece of equipment, train them in terms of interacting with a difficult customer. They're able to practice this in a virtual controlled environment before doing so on the job. Another major area involving training relates to training in the industrial space, such as workers working with nuclear reactors. The military is using this for training. And using VR in this space is really effective. You can train someone on a potentially dangerous, using a potentially dangerous machine or working with a hazardous chemical in VR before doing so in real life. So they're able to make these same mistakes without having the actual physical consequences. So we have training, employment. Another area that's definitely emerging is education. And this is both in the K through 12 and higher ed context. So in the K through 12 context, using VR, you can take your students on a virtual field trip. If you're learning about ancient Egypt, you can actually go to ancient Egypt using VR. You can have a dinosaur rummaging through the classroom. And there are a number of VR experiences for these sorts of virtual field trips, virtual learning. And we're also seeing a lot of AR used in the higher education space. So you have examples of universities using AR science labs, trying to replicate what would be typically a really costly science lab working on potentially risky experiments. Students are able to do that in a state-of-the-art AR lab if those facilities are unavailable. You even have law schools now looking into using XR technology in the classroom, which I feel like law school is maybe the most traditional of all educational environments. So even there, you're seeing this technology. Yeah, so definitely gaming, education, training, and then you're also seeing it for a number of other uses like AR for wayfinding. You have heads-up displays in vehicles these days in which you're able to map this digital content onto a real-world environment to help with navigation and wayfinding. So those are just some of the current uses we're seeing in this space. And gaming definitely is still a leading use case, but we're going to keep seeing innovation in these other spaces as well.
Yeah. Again, it's fascinating to see how it's all developing. I'm thinking about in the training section, how far we've come from when I took driver education in school and they would put the blurry glasses on you so it would simulate being drunk, to now actually being able to simulate that you're impaired while you're taking your defensive driving course, right? It's rapidly changed. One of the fascinating things about this whole technology is this isotropic pace in which the reality is becoming much more realistic, right? And in order to get that reality to become more realistic, I think is dependent on the use and collection of enormous amounts of data for all kinds of reasons. And we'll drill down on some of that. In the report that you guys wrote, you identified as a top legal risk privacy and security, which appears to be outpacing much more traditional types of concerns: product liability, health and safety, intellectual property rights. Can you talk a little bit? Again, just to be more specific about that, as we're collecting all of this data, we think about what are the rules around data collection. How is this data being used for not necessarily an education or training environment in the surveillance world, for example? What are the impacts of social engineering? What are the impacts and what are the considerations around freedom of speech? The interaction that happens in the gaming world between people. And so as you think about that, how are you thinking about privacy and or security risks that are associated with these immersive technologies?
Yeah, definitely. I think you really picked up on a number of concerns and future-facing risks that folks are thinking about today. I find that it might be helpful to discuss some risks that might be specific to VR, more specific to AR, and sort of go from there. So as you highlighted, a massive amount of data is being collected, and much of this data collection is necessary for the functioning of the device or software. There's this statistic that folks like to use in which 20 minutes of a VR experience can generate up to 1 million data points. So you have all of these data elements being collected constantly. And a lot of these data elements, again, are necessary for these devices to function. You need to have an understanding of where a user is located within a space where they're experiencing VR to know where to serve them the content. You need to track things like eye gaze or the movement of pupils in order to make sure that the right reality is being shown to the user in a focused and correct way. You need to track the limbs of users in a lot of these VR experiences. So things like head and neck movement, also the movement of hands in the case of using more traditional haptic controllers, as well as hand tracking. Some of these experiences collect data involving gait or the movement of legs or feet. So you have all of this information that necessarily is being tracked in VR. So you have this vast amount of data. And in the VR space in particular, a lot of the risks we're seeing are future facing. So we're collecting all of this data, much of which is biometric, which is sensitive. So something like eye gaze data, the change in someone's pupils. And a lot of the future-looking risks centers around the idea of a user encountering specific content and information about how maybe their pupil size changed in response to that content, or how long they stared at that content, to gain some sort of insight into how interested the user is in that content. And this can be used potentially in a number of ways. One would be to adjust a game's like difficulty in real time. If it's thought that the way I'm interacting, this game might be too difficult for me, maybe then the game becomes a little easier to map to my preferences and gaming ability. So that's definitely one concern. Another would be the use of that sort of data for advertising purposes. I'm using my sort of gaze data to say, oh, this user's interested particularly in this type of content. And then that may be entering an ad tech ecosystem and helping fuel a more granular user profile for something like behavioral advertising. So that's really the VR space. So AR, the concerns are a little different. AR, as I mentioned earlier, it's often used with a mobile device, so it can be used in public, so outside of the home. And potentially in that situation, the user would be capturing data from bystanders, data about their location, their surroundings. And then a number of questions emerge around what are the rights of bystanders whose data might be captured? Do they have rights over this data? How is their data being protected? Do they have notice? What sort of transparency is at work? So those are just some of the top of mind privacy risks we're looking at today with VR and then with AR.
Yeah, it's again, I think it's a lot of the legislation that was written even recently, I don't think had the foresight to contemplate this type of technology. So you raise some interesting questions and concerns as we think about that. CCPA came into effect this past year in January. It has specific language that talks about these kinds of things. As people are thinking about compliance with CCPA, with CDPA, with GDPR, with HIPAA, maybe with there are all kinds of implications here. What should people be thinking about, and what kind of guidance should you be giving people in terms of compliance with those kinds of laws?
Yeah, definitely. And I think you definitely hit the nail on the head with the fact that these laws were written without contemplating this technology. So definitely XR would in many cases fall under GDPR, CCPA, the law in Virginia. But as you noted, these lawmakers really didn't contemplate the power of this technology. So a lot of the data that I was just talking about is biometric data or biologically related data. Many of those types of biometrics would likely fall under something like CCPA or GDPR, laws with broader definitions of biometric data. So something like the Illinois biometric law, that's a much more narrow definition. And a lot of what I'm talking about maybe would not fall under that particular law. So you have this biometric data that falls under CCPA, for example. But really, what those laws contemplate when it comes to biometric data is identifiability. The ability to identify an individual based on the collection of a biometric identifier, which identifiability is certainly an important part of privacy. But what isn't really captured under these laws is this biometrically derived data, or Britton Heller calls this biometric psychography. So some of the inferences or conclusions that could be drawn based on something like my eye gaze, and how I'm viewing or perceiving certain content in VR. So those inferences or conclusions that could be used to create some sort of more granular user profile, a lot of those elements really are not covered by current law as we have it today. So that's a major area that isn't covered by the law. But I would definitely encourage companies and developers to think about the privacy implications there. Even though they might be in compliance with one of these legal regimes, there are definitely still a number of privacy concerns there and ethical concerns. Something else to think about with these laws is, you have a number of rights provided to consumers over their personal information. You have a number of requirements placed on companies. But some of these rights and requirements might need to be rethought when it comes to something like virtual reality. So you have with the CCPA, deletion rights, rights to information, access rights, et cetera. It will be very interesting to see how this plays out with VR, because as I said before, you have this vast collection of data. How do you make sense of that for the user? How do you really provide access to all of this data? That's something that I think needs to maybe be re-examined, maybe not in the law, but at least re-examined by the companies who are collecting this information or potentially sharing this information. Another major area where that really is not contemplated by current law, we have, for example, with the law in California, CCPA, you have de-identified data as not, falling under various requirements of the law. In VR, it's starting to become clear based on a few different studies that even if certain tracking data is de-identified, it could be very easy to actually identify that user. So a recent study came out by a PhD student at Stanford, Mark Miller. And in his paper for his project, he took 511 participants and had them participate in 10 minutes of a VR experience, during which their head movements and hand movements were tracked. All of this data was, de-identified. It was, not connected to the particular individual, but through using a random forest, which is a pretty elementary machine learning technique, it's been around for a while, that model was able to identify each user based on their head and hand movements at a 95% accuracy rate. So even though this data might be de-identified and maybe would not fall under some of these laws, you very much still could identify users just based on the uniqueness of this tracking data. Yeah. So there are definitely a few areas that fall outside the law that, that these companies need to be thinking about. But definitely, a lot of this personal information, biometric data, does fall under these laws. So companies, like with other technologies, other emerging technologies, need to be complying with user requests and complying with the text of the law.
Yeah, it's again very complicated to think about in some respects. Beyond the law, Jeremy, can you talk a little bit about if I'm in the augmented reality business? How do I think about building my platform? How do I think about communicating to my customers in a way that is sort of a privacy by design mentality? What are the sort of the policy kinds of things I should be thinking about as a company? What are the forward-facing things I should be saying to my customers so that everybody understands the value proposition of the benefit of what they're doing in trade-off for the data that's being collected about them?
Definitely. Yeah, I think that a big piece involving emerging technology when it comes to policy is the use of these ethical review boards. And this could be something internal to the company. It could be an external third party. But we really are seeing a big embrace of these ethical review boards to try to get out in front of a problem or a privacy risk or challenge before it occurs. And when it comes to privacy by design, in tandem with an ethical review board, this should be a continual discussion. So we're going to have all of this emerging technology. It's going to become increasingly widespread. And you can invite all manner of experts to the table. And these companies should be doing that. They should be talking to, obviously, the technologists, the policy folks, the scholars, but also the marketers, their potential users. With AR in particular, we're going to be seeing this technology used increasingly in public. So not only just the users or early adopters of this technology, but bringing these bystanders, these just potential folks who are going to come into contact with this technology, giving them a seat at the table. The folks who maybe typically don't have a seat at the table, who might be underrepresented or not well, just really often not invited to the table, to the discussion. I think that's a really important piece, and the ability to, as this technology changes and evolves in ways that we cannot anticipate, having to continually have these discussions to think about ethical design and review. And in terms of AR, I think you sort of alluded to this, sort of like notice and transparency to users, to bystanders. This is really a challenging area that a lot of folks are thinking about right now. So today, when folks are walking around in public and they have their mobile device and they're kind of like holding it up, you maybe can tell like, oh, they might be recording me or taking a photo. You can kind of just read that body language, where most of us are very used to sort of seeing how that plays out. But with a pair of AR glasses, which is something that is probably going to be more widespread over the next couple of years, that's a new technology that folks are not used to seeing. And when you look at a lot of the early prototypes, they really look like a typical pair of eyeglasses, like what we're both wearing right now. So to the untrained eye, they'll just look like a pair of glasses. So there are all sorts of ideas about providing that sort of notice and transparency to bystanders. Do they use a particular light or colored light when these glasses are maybe collecting information or collecting video potentially? Those are all questions that folks are currently grappling with, and they're definitely difficult to answer. And those are really important discussions, I think, on the policy end to have. How do we provide transparency into this new technology, not only for the user, but for anyone who might come into contact with this emerging tech?
Yeah, this is fascinating. We've come a long way from Flash Gordon and the Jetsons,
right.
And here we are now, where some of that fantasy has become reality. In light of that sort of analogy, what was your first experience with virtual reality, and how unknowingly did the young Jeremy get influenced by what you're doing at FPF today?
Yeah. So my first experience with VR was a few years ago. This is a very, I'm definitely locating myself geographically by saying this. This is a very DC phenomenon. I was attending this sort of networking event, and it was at this really tiny bar in Washington, D.C. And this was way before the pandemic. So we could all be very squished into a crowded bar. That was a typical thing back then. And I got to this event and I really couldn't even move. You couldn't really talk to anyone, or if you saw someone across the room, you couldn't even get their attention. You couldn't even get a drink at the bar. It was so crowded. So I kind of got pushed into this corner, and there was someone there with I was like, oh, that looks like a VR headset. What are they up to? And I was talking to the person, and they actually worked for Oculus, and they had at the time the Oculus Rift set up, which was at the time Oculus's cutting edge headset. And they said, oh, do you want to try it? And I was looking around, I can't even move in this place. Sure, I'll try this. I'll try this VR headset out. And they, put it on my head, and I think they were whisking me around the world virtually. And I was really amazed. And I kept kind of just spinning around in a circle, craning my neck, and just seeing, wow, this really is a fully immersive environment. I thought that was a great experience. And then from there, I sort of, dabbled in VR here and there. I learned more about AR and how I had used AR in the past, using things like, filters for Snap or Instagram. So I started to learn more about this technology, and then it was decided that this was going to be an issue area that we were going to tackle at FPF. At that time, I still didn't know much about this particular area, but I had at least experienced VR a few times. So I was like, okay, this is cool. I feel like I have a taste of what this is all about and what's so cool about this technology and some of the benefits it provides. So that was my first experience. At that time, I had no idea that I was going to be thinking about these things in depth, but it was a good first experience.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. It's fun to hear how those things have just started to emerge. And I can't wait to complain about how crowded I feel in a bar again, and
Right.
somebody putting Oculus glasses on my forehead to distract me. I hope we're back to that great discomfort in life sometime very soon.
Yeah, definitely. Now we just need to engage in social VR experiences and like come into contact with others' avatars. So,
yeah, well, and part and parcel, COVID sort of forced some of that discussion on us in the past year, right? I mean, interesting how times influence technology and vice versa.
Definitely.
Jeremy, we are at the bottom of our time here. We could talk about this for hours, but I appreciate you carving out some time for me today and for the people that'll be watching this online. So number one, I want to thank you and everybody else at FPF for all the work you're doing on this and all the hard work you do in general. It's a great organization. And so thank you for that. Thank you for spending time with me today and talking about this just quite interesting topic. It's controversial, it's moving fast, and you've given us a lot to think about and provided some interesting information about that. So, and then, lastly, knowing that people like the FPF are paying attention to this, I think should give great comfort to all of us that reasonable people are trying to put some method to the madness as we approach this next generation of technology. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you everybody for watching.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome.